Well, hey everyone, welcome back to your Essentials group on the Psalms. Today we're going to look at Psalm 80, which is a psalm that's both a plea for help and it's also a historical psalm. It's one that details this really important event in Israel's history, which was their exile under the Babylonians. It's an event, obviously, that brings up this whole host of fascinating issues for us to think about as Christians. But before we look at that, I'd like us to focus on how the psalm begins and how it's specifically organized.
Well, notice at the very beginning the interesting way that the psalmist invokes God's help. He says, "Listen, O shepherd of Israel, who led Joseph like a flock." Notice he mentions Joseph, which is important because remember, Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery and brought down to Egypt. But ultimately, this misfortune saved his family and the people of Israel, because Joseph was eventually able to save his family during a time of severe famine. In other words, God used the misfortune of Joseph for the ultimate good of his people.
And that story is relevant here because at the beginning of the psalm, we see the way the psalmist is asking God to do the exact same kind of work in their own context, which is work out the redemption of God's people in total disaster. To remind you again, the psalmist writes in this context of Israel being completely destroyed and taken captive by the Babylonians. And so he says, listen to us. You've worked redemption before, and we know that you can do it again. And so the refrain that you'll see repeated 3 times when you read through it is, "Restore us, O God." And that is both the main request in the psalm, and it's also the poetic feature that organizes the psalmist's retelling of what God has done with Israel.
And when we look at how the refrain organizes the psalm, we see that there are basically 4 parts. An opening plea for God to be exactly who he has been in the past, then a lament about how Israel has become debased after being destroyed by Babylon, and then there's a retelling of how Israel has been favored by God, saved from slavery in Egypt, and given a good land. And so the psalmist pleads, "Why would you abandon us now?" Finally, the psalmist says, "Bring us someone to save us."
And you'll notice in verses 8 through 16, which is sort of the middle of the psalm, the way that there is this poetic language to describe Israel's history. And I just say, don't let this intimidate you. Rather, use it to reflect on the nature of God's own work with Israel. Because remember, this is in fact what Jesus does. He also refers to Israel as a vine, and even to his own work as the truer and better vine of Israel. And so don't be afraid to let this imagery illuminate your own context. It's what Jesus does. So for instance, the church might not be under siege from Babylon, but she is certainly afflicted and under attack from other forces at work within the world. And perhaps even you and your family have had to face affliction that this language might illuminate. So you can pray with the psalmist in a genuine sense, "Restore us, O Lord."
Finally, I hope you'll note the way the psalmist turns back to God's redemptive work in order to make a plea for his mercy. That is, of course, exactly what Christians can do with the redemptive work of Jesus. We can turn back to it, claim it, see God's own good character in it. And when we doubt, cry out to him saying, "You have redeemed us before, do it again." This psalm is an incredible resource for any of us who undergo suffering or affliction. It shows us that we have a story, a shared past with God, and we are welcome to cry out to him that his face might still shine on us. In fact, it has literally in the face of his Son, Jesus Christ.
So we hope you have a great discussion today and that you learn more about what it might look like to seek God using both Israel's history and ours. Thank you for joining us.